Hey y'all, it's Lola the Manager, your new favorite project manager, tech junkie, and entrepreneur. This is episode 12 of Life as a Project Manager. In my last video, we created a project schedule for the mock project that I created for a restaurant website launch. In today's video, we are keeping the same energy with that mock project, and we are going to develop a resource management plan. A resource management plan is the key component of the entire project plan that outlines how the resources, human, material, equipment, and financial will be acquired, allocated, and managed throughout the entire project lifecycle. Now, there are about 6 main objectives of a resource management plan. First one is resource identification. The purpose of this is to identify the specific resources required for the project. So this includes the team members, subject matter experts, contractors, materials, equipment, facilities, and the funding sources. We need the funds. Next is resource acquisition. Purpose of this is to define the processes and strategies for acquiring or procuring the necessary resources. So like hiring staff, purchasing materials, or securing external vendors and services. Next, we have resource allocation. So this allows us to determine when and how resources will be assigned to specific projects and tasks, ensuring optimal utilization and avoiding over allocation or under allocation. Then there's resource leveling. This is where you're resolving conflicts or over allocation of resources by adjusting schedule, reassigning resources, or acquiring additional resources as needed. Then there's resource tracking. That's the process of monitoring and tracking resource utilization, costs, and performance throughout the project to ensure efficient use and identify potential issues or deviations from the plan. And lastly, you have resource management policies. This is where you're going to establish the policies and procedures for managing these resources. So this is where you're probably going to see like guidelines for time tracking, expense reporting, resource substitution, and resource release upon project completion. So that was a lot of language. That was a lot of resource. And honestly, this reminds me of when I taught 12th grade economics. So let me take it back a little bit so I can break it down just a little bit more what resources actually are. In economics, there are 4 types of resources: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Land, those are the natural resources that we see within the earth, our plants, our soil, these different things that you need, they are provided in the land, and that is a resource for us. Labor, that is human capital. That is the work that needs to get done. So the land means nothing until we put someone to work to actually do something with the land. Then we have capital. Capital is where you're gonna see the money, right? So this is where we get our financial resources so we can get the equipment, the materials to do what we have to do. And then when we're talking about entrepreneurship, that is the genius behind the idea in which we need to utilize land and we need laborers to do the work and we need to provide them financial capital or resources so they can do the work. But it all starts from an entrepreneur's brain, right? That's kind of how I taught it to my students, and that's how I'm teaching it to you. So now that we understand resources as a whole, when we look at the context of a project, there's a lot of resources involved in these projects. They require money. That's probably one of the biggest resources, right? But money means nothing if we don't have people to do the work. So we need human resources. We need actual humans to do the work. But then on top of needing humans, well, a human can't just make a computer. They can't just make equipment. They just can't make whatever needs to get done. They need some materials or equipment to do what they need to do. So now you're seeing the intersectionality of what I taught my students in economics and how that plays in projects. So now when we come to creating a resource management plan, there needs to be some type of structure in how all of this is going to work. Now, what I do want to throw in as a caveat is depending on how things work at your company in your specific role as a project manager, you may not have to do this part. This might already be done for you by the time you have your project. But the purpose of this is for you to know what it is and how to do it so that if you're in the position where you need to do it, you can. Now, before I take you to the computer so we can look at my sample resource management plan, Y'all know I gotta give you the definitions up first, so listen up, pay attention. When it comes to the resource management plan specifically, like the actual tangible spreadsheet that we're gonna utilize, there's about 7 different parts to it. As always, I tell you, you customize based off of the company and project that you're working on. But for this, I'm gonna make sure you get all the tea, okay? First up, we have resource requirements. So this is a detailed list of all the resources needed for the project. This is going to include their roles, responsibilities, skills, and the quantities. For instance, for this mock project that we've been walking through, we have a restaurant website launch. Now, we know that we need a project manager, we need a web designer, we need a content creator, we need all these different elements, all these different people. In this resource management plan, we should be identifying these roles, what they're actually responsible for doing, what type of skills do they need to have, and how many of each do we need? Do we need 4 project managers? Do we need 2 web developers? Do we need 1 content creator? That's what we mean when we say resource requirements. Now you have the resource calendar. This is a timeline or schedule that outlines what specific resource will be needed and for what duration. So interestingly enough, on some projects, you don't need people for the entire duration of the project. So you may need a project manager from the beginning to end, but you may not need a web developer from beginning to end. You may need a web developer for only 2 weeks out of a 10-week project. And knowing that difference matters because it affects pay, it affects materials, it affects equipment, it affects a lot of things. So you need to know these specific details within your calendar. Then we have the resource acquisition strategy. So these are your plans for hiring, contracting, or procuring the necessary resources, including cost estimates and approval processes. So when you look at the word acquisition, it breaks down into the word acquire. And when you acquire something, you get something. We want all these people, but how are we going to get them? We want all this equipment, but how are we going to get it? This is where we create the plan for how we're going to acquire all of this. Also, I want to throw out the word procuring. I've said that twice already. It comes from the word procurement, and procurement is part of vendor management. Vendor management is a part of project management. That's a whole video in itself. But I wanted to point out that when you're procuring something, you are doing the process to get a vendor, meaning you're probably requesting proposals, requesting quotes, requesting information. You may have heard RFPs, RFQs, RFIs. That's what that means, and that falls under the procurement process, but this video isn't about procurement. Then there's the resource allocation matrix. This is a visual, okay? So when you hear the word matrix, understand that you're gonna be looking at a chart. This is a visual representation of how the resources are going to be allocated and assigned to specific activities and work packages within this project. So you've probably seen a version of this already where it's like, hey, the project manager is going to be focusing on this task, but we actually create a chart because one thing about traditional project management, there will be documentation on top of documentation on top of documentation, okay? Woo! Thank God for Scrum. Anyways, so we will create this matrix, this chart, to kind of show what it looks like, because there's a lot of paperwork we go through, so a visual kind of just makes it easier on our eyes. That's honestly the whole purpose of it, because you can literally see it in another document. Now we have the resource management processes. These are detailed processes for allocating resources, leveling, tracking, and reporting. So the key word in this statement is processes. We need detailed processes of how we're going to allocate these resources, how we're going to level these resources. So leveling is a technique that you utilize to make sure that you are able to address resource constraints. Tracking is exactly what it sounds like. What is the process for us to track all the work that the resources are doing, all the resources that we have? How are we going to track it? What does that process look like? And then of course, reporting. So we're tracking all of this, we're leveling all of this, we're allocating all of this. Do we need to report anything? How do we report it? What is the process for getting out these reports? We need that. Then we have resource management roles and responsibilities. These are clearly defined roles and responsibilities for the resource manager, project managers, and team members in managing resources. So when we say resource management, each person on the team does some form of resource management. There's literal resource managers that build these out and they assign tasks. This is one of the reasons why I said you may not have to build out this resource management plan. You may have a resource manager who their job in the PMO is to develop this management plan, assign the resources accordingly, make sure you're aware of the different constraints and all the things that you may need to do in order to get this project assigned to a project manager and in motion. And so we need to outline what the specific roles and responsibilities are for people that have these type of management positions. After the resource manager assigns that to me as the project manager, now I'm responsible for some resources. And then lastly, we have the resource management tools and systems. So this is the identification of the tools and systems that will be used for resource planning and monitoring. So this could be like the project management software that you're using to manage the projects that have resources in them. So it allows you to manage the resources within the software. Also time tracking software. So maybe people on your team have to submit timesheets and time cards that you have to approve. That's time tracking software. These are tools. So we need to identify what these tools are, how we're going to use them, and all that falls into our resource management plan. Now, I know that was a lot. We're going to take a deep breath. Now it's time to get to the fun part. Let's get on the computer and see this plan in action. Alrighty, we are back. Before we can jump into the resource management plan, we have to recap to make sure that we are all following along, especially if we didn't go and catch up on the other videos. So I created a sample project, right? And this project is called the Launchpad Restaurant website. Pretty much, this is a restaurant website launch. So we received the project brief, and I have the sample brief here. We took the information from the brief to create a project charter. We developed this formal charter, and then from the information within the project charter, we were able to develop a work breakdown structure that ends up helping us develop our project schedule. Now that we have that project schedule, we have that charter, we have that brief, we are now developing our resource management plan. I want to reiterate again, not everybody's resource management plan looks like this, and that is okay. The goal is for you to understand the things that you need and customize accordingly. Here you see the different elements that I highlighted in the video with the resource requirements, the resource calendar, resource acquisition strategy, resource allocation matrix, resource management for the processes, roles and responsibilities, and the tools and systems. And then you see the financial management as well, where I specifically outline how we're going to manage the financial processes, reporting and controls, and then as well as the roles and responsibilities. We're going to start at this part. When we look at resources, we are talking about human resources, so the literal people, material resources, the things that the people need in order to do their job. We have equipment, which also falls under the things that people need in order to do their job. And then you have the financial resources. As you know, this project, we are building a website. So you see how detailed it is, where we outline the specific role as well as the quantity. We need one of each of these. And then we highlight if it's a full-time or part-time position. You may also see hourly allocation, meaning this is a 10-week project. This 10 weeks, we have a total of this many hours that are allocated for the project manager, allocated for the web designer, allocated for the front-end developer. So if this is a 10-week project and the project manager is working 40 hours a week, that means there was an allocation of 400 hours for the project manager. When we look at the web designer, if the web designer is part-time, meaning they are working a max of 20 hours a week for the 10 weeks, then that is a total of 200 hours for the whole project. But remember, I also highlighted that sometimes people aren't even working for the full duration. We may only need the web designer for 4 weeks. So 20 hours times 4, that's only 60 hours. And so then we go to the materials and resources. You see it outlines the specific software that will need to be utilized in order to manage resources, the specific equipment that is needed. And then we talk about the budget. So here, we haven't talked about this in a separate video at all. I don't think we really talked about budget, but as you can see here, the overall budget for this was $75,000, including contingency. And I'll talk about contingency after I kind of walk through the numbers. But you see that for design and development, $50,000 was allocated. Content creation and SEO, $15,000 was allocated. Testing and deployment, $5,000 was allocated. And then project management and overhead, $5,000 was allocated. This financial resources is a combination of how much we need for the human resources, the material resources, as well as the equipment resources. You see here, it says including contingency. Look at contingency as a reserve. extra. Let's say this project would actually cost us $50,000. However, we understand that things happen, we might have issues, we looked at the risk, and we allocated $25,000 in reserves just in case we have to go over that $50,000 mark. The way that contingency is typically broken down is there's extra financial resource per category. So there might be an extra $10,000 for the design and development, an extra $5,000 for content creation and SEO, extra for testing and deployment, extra for project management and overhead. The extra is here to let us know like, hey, this is what we have, but the plan is based off of what we actually calculated and allocated. Here, line 11 and 12, you see the resource calendar. You don't need to go recreate another resource calendar like the schedule that we have. You can literally copy the link here and you can show them what that project schedule looks like. You would take this link and you would just copy it here, and now you see what they would be doing. We go to resource acquisition strategy. So how are we going to get these resources? You see for the human resources, we're saying that the project manager is assigned within the organization. So this lets you know that whoever is creating this project or initiating this project or have the brilliant idea, they are within the company and they want to utilize a project manager within the company. Web designer, you see that they said they want someone contract-based, hired through a freelancing platform. Developers, full-time employees hired through job postings or existing staff. So they're going to go put this out there on like a LinkedIn and Indeed and say, hey, we're hiring for this project. Same thing with the web designer. They're going to go on the freelance platform and say, hey, we have this project. It's a quick little contract. Let me know if you're interested. Content creator, same thing. They're going to be on that freelancing platform. SEO specialist, they want to use someone from that freelancing platform. And then quality assurance tester, we may already have an employee on staff or we may have a contractor that we work with often. Let's pull from over there. Materials, you see that it says for the design software, we want to purchase or renew any existing licenses. For development tools, open source or existing organizational licenses. Testing tools, purchase licenses and or use free trial versions. And then project management software, we're going to use what the company already currently uses, or we can do a trial if you have a better idea. Equipment resources, laptops and workstations. So they may provide laptops to the people who are working this project. I know all the contracts that I've been part of, I've gotten a laptop every contract I've worked. They've sent me a laptop. They will send me whatever I need. If I need a headset, if I need a hotspot, if I need even a mouse, they will send it. Then there's servers, right? So the server, the system in which we're going to use for this infrastructure, they're going to use the one that the company already has. Then financial resources, it literally says the project budget has been approved by the project sponsor. So remember, we're doing a restaurant website launch. The project sponsor, who's the owner of this restaurant, already said, hey, I have your initial $50,000 plus contingency. So I have $75,000 for you guys to do what you have to do. And so it talks about how with this acquisition strategy, the payments to the contractors and vendors will be made based on agreed milestones or deliverables within the project. And then any additional expenses or budget changes will need to be approved by that project sponsor. So this is like the breakdown of what it looks like to actually acquire these resources. How are we going to get it? Now, when we go to line 23 and 24, you see the resource allocation matrix, which is literally the same thing from the project schedule. This is how the resources are allocated. This is what they're doing. So you see that a lot of the documentation, they intersect with each other. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to make this over again multiple times. Link it to where you got it from. Then we have resource management. I call this section resource management because it's the management of these different elements. When it comes to resource management, the processes. So here is the breakdown of like, okay, so we're gonna do resource allocation and scheduling through project management software. We're gonna track the resources and their time through timesheets and regular status updates. We're gonna handle the resource conflicts and over allocation through task rescheduling and acquiring additional resources. We're gonna evaluate resource performance through regular feedback and project milestones. So this is the process in which we're going to manage the resources. Now, as we're doing that, their roles and responsibilities will be identified as you see them here. So for the project manager, your overall responsibility is resource planning, acquisition, allocation, and management. For the team lead, so the designers, the developers, you're responsible for managing the resources within their respective areas. So this portion is very essential as a project manager and when it comes to resource management. There is a position known as a functional manager in project management. So the functional manager is the person that leads a department within the organization. So I'll give you an example. In one of my contracts, I've worked as a marketing project manager. In those marketing projects, we have creatives. The creatives are the writers and the designers for that project. However, I am not their manager. They have a functional manager, meaning they are part of a creative department with other writers and designers that are managed by a functional manager. So as a project manager, it is my duty to reach out to that functional manager and said, hey, I have this type of project. Can you help me figure out which resources you're going to allocate to the project? Now, if the resource isn't doing their job properly, then I take that up with the functional manager and say, hey, you allocated this resource, they're not doing their job, or they're saying they don't have time. What can we do here? Because their performance isn't judged by me, it is judged by their functional manager. This is why it says that the team leads or the functional managers are responsible for managing resources within their respective areas. So a functional manager is not responsible for everyone on my project. They're responsible for the people in their department that's working on my project. And then we have the team members responsible for reporting time and resource utilization accurately. As a member of a team, you are responsible for yourself. You govern yourself, you manage yourself, and you manage properly. You are making sure that you report your time. You've worked 8 hours on this project this week. You report that. We want to make sure that we value your time and we don't have you wasting your time where we say that we need you for 30 hours on this project and you realize you only need 5. Then we have the tools and systems. So we talk about project management software. It's going to be used specifically for task assignment, resource allocation, and progress tracking. For time tracking systems, this is going to be specifically used for logging time and monitoring resource utilization. So where you're going to see the capacity of like how much bandwidth does this person have to do the work. And then we have communication tools. This is going to be used for team collaboration. How are we going to communicate throughout this project? Are we sending emails back and forth? Are we on Slack? Are we on Teams? What's going on? And then the financial management part, I don't necessarily think that this is this big on the actual resource management plan, but I broke it down here because I want to make sure that we understand the significant impact of the financial management in the scope of a project. Of course, we're going to identify the processes. For the budget, it's going to be managed and tracked using dedicated financial management systems or spreadsheets. So we're not just going to go write down in our OneNote, this is how much money we're going to spend. No. That's not going to work. Invoices and expenses will be reviewed and approved by the project manager before payment. So this is an important process. Someone can send an invoice and somehow they got paid, but the project manager never signed off on it. So what proof do we really have that you shouldn't have gotten paid for this invoice that you sent in? Regular financial reports will be generated and shared with the project sponsor and stakeholders. So this means someone, it might be the project manager, it might be someone else. They're going to be responsible for pulling these financial reports and providing these status updates on the financial. Any anticipated budget overturns or additional expenses will be communicated to the project sponsor for approval. So the project manager, you are not responsible for making any decisions. Your job is to gather the information and bring it to the people that do make decisions, right? The actual decision makers. And you present it to them and you allow them to tell you what needs to happen and you get approval like that. Contingency reserve of 10% has been included in the project budget to cover any unforeseen expenses. So like I stated earlier, every project should have a contingency reserve, which here it says a 10% minimum, but it can be more. Now, when it comes to financial reporting and controls, it says monthly financial reports will be generated to include budget versus actual expenditures. So when you are creating your project budget, you have your estimated costs, like your budget for this, but then you have the actual cost of it. So we may have budgeted, if we go back up here, we may have budgeted $50,000 for design and development. Time is going by, you're running these reports and you're looking at the actual spend, and this project is supposed to be 10 weeks, but we've already spent $40,000 of the design and development budget in 2 weeks. What are we gonna do for the next 8? This is necessary for you to see how you're going to adjust and pivot as the project manager. How are we gonna change this? We need to have some conversations, because why are we burning through our funds and resources? Forecasted expenditures. So what do you plan to spend on? Budget variance analysis. So looking at the variance between what was allocated and what was actually spent. The burn rate analysis, meaning at the rate in which we're burning through our resources. Financial controls will be implemented, such as expense approval processes. So controls are how are we going to kind of mitigate things from taking a turn. An expense approval process, meaning if you need to expense something for this project, let's say you need to go meet with a vendor and you had to put gas in your car and mileage, you need to expense that. So there's a process in which you submit the paperwork, you submit the proof, it is approved, and then you get reimbursed. Invoice verification. So this means you can't just send me an invoice that said you worked 40 hours this week. So we need to verify that what you sent matches up to what we have in our system as what you did. And then audit trails for financial transactions. So meaning getting audited, getting reviewed, and just to make sure that nothing janky going, you feel me? And then lastly, we have the financial management of the roles and responsibilities. So we're gonna highlight that the project manager, you will be responsible for financial management, budget tracking, and expense approvals. The finance department, or the accountant in the company, is responsible for processing the payment, maintaining the financial record, and generating the report. The project sponsor, which is our restaurant owner here, is responsible for approving the overall project budget and any significant budget changes. That was a lot. And as I stated, you may not need all of this in your resource management plan. It may look completely different, but at least you have a baseline on what to do if you needed to do one. Now let's go back into the main video. And just like that, we made it through another successful video and learned about resource management. You can literally be anywhere in the world right now, but you're here with me getting professional development in the project management space. And I love that for you. I love that for us. Thank you for tuning in. As always, be sure to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Lola the Manager. And always, until next time.